Hello, I'm Scott Davison. I'm the interim dean of the Call College of Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences here at Morehead State University. Today's Call conversation features Dr. David Little, professor of political science here at Morehead State, and Justin Spinks, instructor of philosophy and doctoral student at the University of Kentucky. We're going to be talking about two key figures in the history of ethical thought, Aristotle and Kant. We're going to be talking about human rights and equality and justice and racism. So I'm going to begin by asking Dr. Little to talk with us a little bit about Aristotle, if you would. Thank you.
The question, as I understand it, is would Aristotle, the ancient Greek philosopher, think that racism is wrong? And if he would think it's wrong, then on what basis? I'll argue that if Aristotle knew what racism was, he would condemn it as unjust and unreasonable, not on the basis of human equality, but on the basis of human inequality. Although the concepts of race and racism are of a relatively recent vintage, I think it's fair to say that in general, Greeks were, like most people probably are to some degree or another, lovers of their own language, religion, food, city, values, tradition, and way of life. Greeks referred to non-Greeks as barbarians because foreign languages sounded to them like bar, bar, bar. And maybe to a degree, they were justified in their Greek. Greece produced the first gave birth to philosophy and natural science, and created art and architecture that is still admired 2 millennia later. We aren't going to write books that are read for millennia. Was Aristotle an advocate of Greek exceptionalism? It is not hard to find Aristotle criticizing Greeks or praising non-Greeks. Aristotle himself was from Macedonia, which was just north of the Greek peninsula. Macedonians spoke a dialect of Greek, but the Athenians would have considered Macedonia semi-barbarous, in part because it was ruled by kings. Aristotle lived many years in Athens, but he was not a citizen, and ended up fleeing democratic Athens under threat of persecution. Aristotle worked to transcend the merely parochial through extensive study in what we would call comparative politics. According to Diogenes Laertius, Aristotle and his students collected 158 constitutions from around the known world. Unfortunately, much of that work has been lost. But we do see Aristotle in his work, The Politics, engaging in this sort of comparative work, and then asking the philosophical question, who is right? Aristotle thinks that what's politically possible is deeply dependent on the conditions on the ground, but he also thinks there's a standard in nature, accessible by reason, for what is right, and that right differs from might. What is natural holds true everywhere and always. It is like fire. It burns the same in Morehead as it does in Beijing. Aristotle thinks that custom and habit are important, but he says that we all seek not the ancestral, but the good. Infamously, Aristotle says that some people are slaves by nature. He does so in the context of a discussion of whether slavery is right or wrong. It is interesting that Aristotle says that the justice of slavery requires a discussion because it was a nearly universal practice in the ancient world, although it was not race-based. We have no other record of there being a debate over the justice of slavery. Aristotle says that some people are slaves by nature and are justly enslaved, while others are slaves by convention, law, or force, which is to say, unjustly enslaved. The natural slave, Aristotle suggests, has a body but no soul or mind. The natural slave does not have reason and can only take the commands of others. There is much debate over this, so you should read Aristotle for yourself, but the natural slave seems, to me at least, someone who is severely mentally deficient. Some have argued that natural slavery has a racial component, but Aristotle does not say that it does. What he does say is that natural slaves cannot be identified by their bodies or by who their parents were. We could cancel Aristotle for making the case for a view we find morally repugnant, but it may be fruitful to wonder why Aristotle, in a world where slavery was the norm, would raise questions about its justice. Actual Greek slaves were taken as prisoners in war or born into slavery, and many of them performed cognitively demanding functions as musicians, tutors, and cooks. Athenian slaves also stood a better chance of gaining their freedom than slaves in the antebellum South. In other words, most Greek slaves were, by Aristotle's definition, slaves by convention, rather than slaves by nature. This is true especially in Athens. Aristotle thinks that ideally the best should rule, that is to say, those who are morally and intellectually excellent. Realistically, the legislator should establish a mixed regime that balances the legitimate claims to rule of the rich and the poor, while incorporating as much as possible the even more legitimate claim to rule of virtue. It might sound elitist to say that the best should rule, but I think it's a view shared by modern advocates of representative government, like Thomas Jefferson. Perhaps we wouldn't say that the members of our own Congress are paragons of moral and intellectual virtue, but they are an educated elite and are hardly a cross-section of America, one we could achieve by rolling the dice to decide who should serve in Congress, which is how members of the Athenian Assembly were chosen. Like Plato's Socrates, Aristotle says that democracies emphasize human equality and overlook human difference. Aristotle would agree that there are some characteristics that all human beings share. For example, he begins his book, The Metaphysics, with the claim that all human beings desire to know. And in the Politics, he identifies human beings by their capacity for reasoned speech, or logos. Nevertheless, he sees more differentiation within the human species than we do, and is comfortable making generalizations about sex and people groups that we find morally repugnant. Still, I think he would condemn racism, not from the vantage of equal dignity of all human beings, but from the vantage of virtue. Generalizations only hold true to an extent, and at the end of the day, the morally and intellectually better should rule the worse, as far as is consistent with the stability of the regime, since people who are totally excluded from the regime are likely to become subversives. Writing off people based on bodily characteristics leaves talent unutilized, neglects the most legitimate claim to rule, and undermines the regime's stability. In other words, he would find racism unjust and disadvantageous.
Thank you, David. That is really interesting to hear more about Aristotle. I want to talk about this in a moment and about the connection between racism and slavery in Aristotle and virtue and equality. But first, I'm going to give Justin a chance here to speak. And he's going to talk a little bit about Kant's ethics and the connection between that and rights. Go ahead.
Okay, so yeah, I thought I would sort of take it back a little bit and just kind of think about the nature and foundation of rights, because obviously that's an important thing that we think a lot about right now, and follow at least one line of thinking, because there's a lot of different ways to think about rights, but at least one line of thinking, taking it through Kant to more contemporary thinkers. So the idea of having or seeking to expand rights is something that's very familiar to most Americans. We often speak of rights as though they're owed to us or endowed within us and the world by our Creator. But what exactly is a right, though? When one stops to consider exactly what a right is as a concept, the answer may not be as clear as it seems. There are many ways to consider the nature of rights and their foundation, but I like to consider them in the context of Kantian moral philosophy. Immanuel Kant was an 18th century German philosopher who wrote on a wide range of philosophical topics, but his writings on moral philosophy are among his most influential and enduring. There are two key concepts that underscore Kant's moral philosophy: duty and autonomy. Kant held that an action has moral worth only if it is one that I would universalize, so that everyone else would have to act in the same way. Put another way, if I'm acting in a certain way, like telling a lie, then I'm condoning that action for everyone, and even sanctioning that action so that everyone else should lie when it is convenient to do so. Since this is certainly a world we wouldn't want to live in, and is really almost inconceivable, everyone always lying all the time, that action cannot be said to be moral. From this moral law, Kant derives a second one on the basis of the first one. He says that we ought to always treat others as an end in themselves, and never merely only as a means. Consider again the case of lying. If you lie to someone, you're not properly recognizing their humanity. You're treating them as a means to your own ends or goals, and so they become a mere tool for you to achieve your own aims. The basis of morality for Kant is freedom. He asserts that the moral law, in the first formulation above regarding its universalizability of an action, is a law that we give to ourselves. Since this is since this is a law that we give to ourselves and we do not receive it from an external source, human beings are defined by their autonomy. This word comes from the Greek terms auto, meaning self, and nomos, meaning law or rule. So human beings are self-legislating. We're self-governed, and this is what constitutes our freedom. We have a duty to the law because it is only in acting in a moral way that we really act as human beings, since the essence of humanity for Kant is rationality and freedom. We also have a duty to treat others as an end, since they too are rational, autonomous human beings who are self-governing. So in short, we have a duty to recognize other human beings as equals, who are not the means to the end of another, but rather ends in themselves. Relating this to the idea of rights, a right is something that we owe to another on the basis of their being a rational, free human being. We owe something to others on the basis of their humanity. We have a duty toward them. The etymology of the word duty is related to what is due to someone else, that is, what is owed to them. To illustrate the relation of rights and duties, I'd like to briefly discuss an article written by an American philosopher, Joel Feinberg. There, he introduces a fictional place called Nowheresville. Nowheresville is a place that doesn't have any rights. Feinberg suggests that in this fictional society, we grant people the capacity for kindness, generosity, and benevolence, so that people in Nowheresville do help one another, for example, paying wages for a job well done, but they do so based upon only compassionate or benevolent motives. A good analogy might be the way that we tip a server after a meal in a restaurant. Sure, we might say it's expected to leave a 20% gratuity after a meal, but we're not necessarily obliged to do so. It's not, baked into the ticket, right? The server may be upset if we decide not to tip after an excellent service, but they have no right to complain, since the tip system is based only upon benevolence, gratitude, hence the term gratuity, and a weak notion of desert, but not what is owed to the server. Feinberg rightly points out that Kant would find such a place, this Nowheresville, dreadful, and I hope any of us would. So he allows for duty to make its way into Nowheresville also. He suggests that we only maybe allow duty toward, let's say, the law in an abstract sense, or perhaps we have a duty toward God in this Nowheresville. So we can make promises, contracts, or agreements for fair wages. And our duty to uphold these social relations is thus not toward one another intersubjectively, but only toward a greater sovereign, the law, or God. However, this notion of duty would not be wholly satisfactory for Kant either, since the duties that we have toward one another are only indirect, as opposed to a direct sense of duty toward one another. Feinberg's point here is that when we consider such a world, we would find it appalling. When we take rights away, we're taking away an individual's ability to make a claim against another. To make a claim against another is to make a demand regarding what is owed to that individual. This act of making a claim is the assertion of one's right to be treated as an equal, and it is an assertion of one's fundamental dignity, given that they are a rational, autonomous human. Thus, rights ensure that we have obligations toward one another as equals. Given this understanding of rights as a kind of claim to equality, one can see how troubling racial inequality becomes in this light. People sometimes make the case that racial inequality only can manifest in explicit forms of bigotry, hatred, and violence against Black and brown people. However, racism can simply mean persisting structural social inequalities that give advantages to one race over another. The philosopher Rawls argued that the definition, the essence of injustice, is the existence of inequality within a society that does not contribute to the benefit of everyone, and instead only benefits those who stand to gain the most from such structural inequalities. Thus, the question we must ask ourselves in modern America is whether it is the case that there are individuals whose dignity and humanity is not being recognized, that their claims to equal treatment are not being taken seriously simply on the basis of their skin color. And if the answer to that question is yes, then racial injustice still exists in our country.
Thank you, Justin. That was really interesting and helpful. I can see that our conversation could go off in many different directions here because there are so many interesting angles here. Um, it does seem that one difference that jumps off the page at me here in terms of what we would say about Aristotle and Kant and racism is that they would have completely different reasons for saying that racism is wrong. And that for Aristotle, racism is wrong not because of basic human equality, but because of human capacities and dignity that flow from that. Whereas for Kant, he would say our common humanity and the being autonomous ends in ourselves requires that everybody be treated with respect in a way that precludes racism. Does that seem fair to both of you?
Yes, I think so. And if I may add, and David might be able to correct me a little bit if I'm a little bit wrong on this, but I'm not even sure, Aristotle had much of a concept in terms of like rights, right? Because rights is kind of a relatively young concept historically. And I think what David is saying is right about Aristotle, but it's interesting to talk about the wrongness of racism, but without introducing the concept of right within that. And I think that's actually really interesting and instructive for us today. Like, thinking about why this is wrong, but not merely just appealing to the notion of rights, which is of course important to do so, but thinking about it, absent of that framework that we kind of take for granted.
I agree with that. At least the modern language of rights is certainly alien to Aristotle. Although I would say that there is something for him that is naturally right, although he's quite cagey about specifying exactly the contents of that.
It's helpful to talk about Aristotle here because people often point to him as an example of someone who defends slavery. And of course, as you point out, the truth is a lot more complicated than that. And for Aristotle, slavery has nothing to do with race. So when we talk about slavery and talk about Aristotle, there's a real danger of misunderstanding what he's talking about. So it's very helpful to have that historical background. I really appreciate that. Um, uh, of course, Aristotle was not a fan of democracy, as you point out, and he thought the virtuous should rule. And of course, some people, you pointed out, Thomas Jefferson would also argue that representative government requires virtuous rulers and not just drawing lots to see who might serve. I wonder, how should we think about guaranteeing or trying to preserve people's ability to participate politically today in America in a way that um, tries to fend off the lingering effects of racism that we have in our culture. If we understand that Aristotle would hold that racism is not a reason, not a racism is a problem when it prevents political participation. How should we think about that from a current perspective? Do you have any thoughts about that, either one of you?
Well, I think Jefferson's a good place to start because he, like Aristotle, thinks that the aristoi, the best, should rule. And so he makes the case for meritocracy. And Jefferson's plan for that is an elaborate system of public education that begins at the earliest levels. And moderns, tend to eschew virtue education, but I think they probably both agree that really both moral and intellectual excellence is necessary in government, and that the only way to get that is to start at the earliest levels. And that's not just formal education, but also in the family. Beyond that, the mechanism of elections promotes, at least the hope is that people vote for those who are qualified for the office, both not corrupt personally, and we still talk about public corruption, and also, that are competent people that are the best for the job. And we can also, I think it would support, we could talk about civil service exams, the foreign service exam that tests for your knowledge of the actual field. So your people are not chosen based on their connections, but based on their competence for the job. And as you say, I think race is not a category for Aristotle. So, obviously, any sort of attempt to make race a category for choosing people for office would be, or for the franchise, would be out of bounds.
It's helpful to think about the role of education here, and of course, democracy presupposes that people are being rational, sensible actors when they're voting. And we have, of course, historically low rates of participation in voting. We might think of voting as a right in Kant's sense, but not something everyone exercises. In this country, of course, we have civil rights legislation that's not very old that guarantees political participation regardless of race. And so it's interesting to think about current legislation that's designed to change the conditions in which people vote. And some people are arguing that this restricts rights. And going back to Kant's idea that people, in virtue of being autonomous ends in themselves, deserve to be treated with dignity and respect. Maybe I'll ask you, Justin, do you think of questions about voting access as reflecting the kind of concerns that we would have if we came from a Kantian point of view, thinking about rights and claims?
Oh, right, absolutely. Because again, when it comes to, voting, that's, a way of exercising your will, right? And exercising your autonomy. And again, that's the way in which we can enact, legislation and get more people participating in the democratic process. And that's why it's so important to have more access to voting. And if there's any kind of legislation out there, which again a lot of people are arguing, you see in a lot of various states, particularly more conservative leaning states, these laws where they're limiting access to voting, and it raises the question, again, are these laws constructed in such a way that certain groups are being privileged over another group? And if that is the case, then again, you're denying access. You're denying the ability of someone who has a right to make, a valid claim, the ability to exercise their autonomous will. And if that's occurring, then again, you have a clear issue. So that's why legislation is important to protect people's rights, and that shows a sort of an important intersection between morality and rights.
I do see in the contemporary debate about voting legislation echoes of the idea that education is really important, and a sort of mistrust of the ordinary person, in the sense that not everybody's prepared to vote reasonably. There's this idea that not everybody's in a position to vote reasonably. And there's also this criticism of popular elections, that the wrong considerations are playing an outsized role. And of course, we see this debate about social media and the role that it plays in influencing people, and criticisms that go back to Plato and Aristotle because of the influence of democracy, influences in democracy that are inappropriate influences. So it does seem to be important that people are equipped to be good citizens in voting well. Is there a tension here between the Aristotelian idea that a proper education is important and the Kantian idea that everybody should have equal access?
I don't necessarily think so, and I don't want to get too much into the weeds in it, but this is an interesting question, and it kind of rests a little bit in Kant's distinctive notion of freedom or autonomy. For Kant, acting freely doesn't just mean doing whatever you want to do, right? It's acting in accordance for him with moral law. Autonomy is self-legislation, but interestingly enough, for him, if you're merely following inclination, like, oh, hungry and I want to go eat at Pizza Hut right now. Okay, that's fine. And you could say that's your choice, right? And it is your choice insofar as you're the one who made it, but you're following inclination. And you could argue that there may be a connection there in the political realm as well. You know, somebody who only exercises a vote on the basis of a whim or misinformation or disinformation, as the case may be, that insofar as those choices are guided by, you know, kind of we might argue non-rational means, then that's not necessarily a free choice. So therefore, you know, education, I think, you know, could be equally important. Now, again, this is obviously occurring in a very different context than, you know, than the way in which Aristotle is conceiving of education. But I don't necessarily think that there's a strong tension here, because again, Kant's notion of freedom isn't what we, to use a term, libertarian freedom, just, you know, free to do whatever you want. But it's a very restricted notion of, again, autonomy in terms of acting according to moral principles.
Yeah, I think I would say that they probably would both have concerns about the unrestricted rule of the majority. And that cuts against at least one version of equality. And this would go for, you know, a host of liberals in the 18th and 19th centuries. That, you know, yeah, not everyone is qualified for participation. But that doesn't mean race has something to do with it.
Right, that's a good point, and that's interesting that to think about current legislation affecting voter access and the unintended effects of some of that legislation and how it might restrict access. But I think that the goal is to restrict access in some sense along lines that's reasonable in principle. At least that's the justification provided by that legislation. So that debate that continues over voter access is touching on all these questions that we have addressed today. I can see that we've sort of run out of time here, although I'd like to continue this conversation. There's so many other directions in which we could go. Maybe we'll have another conversation, a follow-up at another point in time. But let me pause here and just thank my participants again for joining us here today for a call to conversation. David Little and Justin Spinks, thank you again, both of you, very much. This has been extremely interesting and helpful, and I'm sure that our listeners will be led to understand some of these questions in a deeper way, thanks to your expertise. So I appreciate it. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. This was fun.
And I hope our listeners and viewers will join us for other occasions on which we have our call conversations.